A Wehrmacht lieutenant defied the SS in broad daylight to save 100 Jewish families from extermination in 1942. The SS investigated him. Heinrich Himmler vowed to arrest him after the war. Yet, the man who blocked the bridge wore a Nazi Party pin on his uniform. Before we go deeper into how this decision changed hundreds of lives forever, make sure to subscribe for more history that actually happened. The contradiction sits at the center of Albert Batel's story like a paradox carved in steel. He was a German patriot who loved his country, a lawyer who joined the Nazi Party in 1933, and a reserve officer who served a Wehrmacht without complaint. Yet, on July 26, 1942, in a Polish city called Przemiel, this 51-year-old lieutenant did something that would reach the desk of Adolf Hitler's right-hand man and place his name on a list marked for arrest by the Reichsfuhrer SS himself. Batel ordered German soldiers to aim their weapons at other Germans. He commandeered Wehrmacht trucks to rescue Jews from an SS roundup. He blocked the only bridge into the ghetto and dared the SS to cross. The sergeant major stationed at that bridge threatened to open fire on SS commandos if they advanced. This happened in occupied Poland in the summer of 1942, when the machinery of the final solution operated at industrial speed, and when disobedience to the SS meant a bullet in a courtyard or a noose in a prison. Batel did not act alone, but he acted knowing the consequences. The question is not why the SS wanted him arrested. The question is how a Nazi Party member came to stand between the gas chambers and 100 Jewish families, and what that single morning reveals about the choices available to men in uniform during history's darkest machinery. To understand the bridge at Przemiel, you must first understand the man who held it. Albert Batel was born on January 21, 1891, in Kleinpramsen, a village in Prussian Silesia near what is now the Polish border. His family was German through generations, rooted in the Prussian tradition of discipline and service. Batel grew up in the fading years of the German Empire, when military service was considered the highest duty a man could perform. When the Great War erupted in 1914, he joined the Imperial German Army and fought on the Western Front. He survived the trenches, the gas, the artillery barrages that turned French soil into moonscapes. He returned to a Germany that had lost everything: its empire, its pride, its sense of order. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 stripped Germany of territory and imposed reparations that crippled the economy. Inflation ravaged savings. Political violence consumed the streets. The Weimar Republic struggled to govern a nation that did not believe in it. Batel, like millions of German veterans, faced a choice. Some turned to radical politics. Others retreated into private life. Batel chose law. He enrolled at the University of Munich and later transferred to the University of Breslau, studying economics and jurisprudence. By the late 1920s, he had established himself as a lawyer in Breslau, the capital of Silesia. He built a respectable practice, advised clients, argued cases. He was not a revolutionary. He was not a political agitator. He was a middle-aged professional trying to make sense of a country that seemed to be tearing itself apart. When Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, Batel made a decision that millions of Germans made. He joined the Nazi Party. His membership number was recorded in May 1933, just months after the Reichstag fire and the enabling act that gave Hitler dictatorial power. Batel was 42 years old. He had survived one war and one economic collapse. Perhaps he believed, as many did, that the Nazis would restore order. Perhaps he thought membership was necessary for his career. Perhaps he simply wanted to belong to something larger than himself in a time of chaos. The historical record does not explain his motivations. It only records the fact: Albert Batel, lawyer from Breslau, member of the Nazi Party. But Batel's membership came with complications. Before the war, he was indicted before a Nazi Party tribunal for extending a loan to a Jewish colleague. In the new Germany, such behavior was considered suspect. Jews were being excluded from the professions, stripped of citizenship, isolated from German society. To help a Jew financially, was to question the racial doctrine that underpinned the Nazi state. Battel was reprimanded, but he kept his law license. The incident marked him as someone whose loyalties were unclear. The Nazi Party noted his name. The file remained open. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Battel was 48 years old, too old for frontline combat, but eligible for reserve duty. The Wehrmacht mobilized lawyers, teachers, engineers, anyone with education and organizational skills. By 1942, Battel held the rank of Oberleutnant or first lieutenant and was stationed in Przemiel, a city in southern Poland along the San River. Przemiel had a long history as a fortress city sitting at the crossroads of Polish, Ukrainian, and Jewish cultures. Before the war, its population included approximately 24,000 Jews, making up about a third of the city's inhabitants. They lived in a vibrant community with synagogues, schools, businesses, and cultural institutions. When the Germans occupied the city in June 1941, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, that community became a target. The German occupation authority divided Przemiel into administrative zones. The Wehrmacht, the regular German army, controlled military operations. The SS, Heinrich Himmler's paramilitary organization, controlled security and racial policy. Local commanders had to navigate the tension between these two power structures. In Przemiel, the Wehrmacht garrison was commanded by Major Max Liedtke, a career officer in his 40s. Liedtke was responsible for logistics, supply lines, and the defense of the city against potential partisan attacks. His adjutant, the officer who handled administrative duties and liaison work, was Albert Battel. The two men formed a working relationship. Liedtke relied on Battel's legal training to interpret orders and manage disputes. Battel, in turn, gained insight into the operations of both the Wehrmacht and the SS. By the summer of 1942, Przemiel's Jewish population had been confined to a ghetto. The process was methodical. First, Jews were required to wear white armbands with a blue Star of David. Then they were banned from certain streets and professions. Then they were forced to relocate to a designated area of the city, a cramped district where thousands lived in conditions designed to weaken and isolate them. Walls went up. Guards took positions. The ghetto became a prison. The official justification was security. The real purpose was preparation. The SS was implementing Operation Reinhard, the plan to exterminate the Jewish population of occupied Poland. 3 death camps had been constructed specifically for this purpose: Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. Belzec, located about 50 miles from Przemiel, had begun operations in March 1942. By July, it was killing thousands of people per day using carbon monoxide gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. Trains arrived from ghettos across southern Poland. People were told they were being resettled for labor. They were dead within hours of arrival. The term used by the SS for these operations was action, meaning action or operation. An action involved sealing off a ghetto, rounding up the inhabitants, transporting them by rail to a death camp, and murdering them. The process was bureaucratic, efficient, and relentless. The first major action in Przemiel was scheduled for July 26, 1942. The SS had prepared the logistics. Trains were arranged. Guards were positioned. The Jewish Council, or Judenrat, which the Germans forced to administer the ghetto, was informed that the population would be resettled to the east. Everyone understood what this meant. There would be no resettlement. There would be Belzec. In the days before the action, word reached the Wehrmacht garrison. Liedtke and Battel learned that the SS planned to liquidate the entire ghetto. Hundreds of Jewish workers were employed by the Wehrmacht in various capacities: tailors repairing uniforms, cobblers fixing boots, carpenters building structures, laborers maintaining facilities. These workers were valuable to the Wehrmacht's operations. Liedtke and Battel submitted a formal request to the SS, exempt the Jewish workers employed by the Wehrmacht from deportation. The request was denied. The SS made clear that no exceptions would be granted. Every Jew in Przemiel would be deported to Belzec. The military's labor needs were irrelevant. Racial policy took precedence. Battel and Liedtke faced a decision. They could comply with SS orders and allow the workers to be taken. This was the expected course of action. The Wehrmacht had no authority over SS racial policy. Interfering would be insubordination, possibly treason. Or they could act. They chose to act. On the morning of July 26, 1942, the SS assembled its forces. The ghetto in Przemiel sat on the eastern side of the San River, separated from the main city by a bridge. This bridge was the only access point into the ghetto. Controlling the bridge meant controlling access. The SS planned to cross at dawn, seal the ghetto, and begin the roundup. Battel and Liedtke moved first. They ordered Wehrmacht soldiers to take positions at the bridge. The sergeant major in command of the bridge detail received explicit instructions: block the bridge, allow no one to pass without authorization from Major Liedtke. If the SS attempts to cross, stop them, by force if necessary. The SS column approached. They had vehicles, armed guards, and orders signed by SS authorities. They expected the Wehrmacht to step aside. They were wrong. The Wehrmacht soldiers at the bridge did not move. The sergeant major informed the SS that the bridge was closed by order of the military commandant. The SS officers demanded passage. The sergeant major refused. Accounts differ on the exact exchange, but witnesses later testified that the Wehrmacht sergeant major made a statement that froze the SS advance. If you attempt to cross this bridge, I will order my men to open fire. A German soldier was threatening to shoot German SS men. In occupied Poland, in broad daylight, in front of local inhabitants who watched from windows and doorways, the SS column stopped. They did not retreat, but they did not advance. The confrontation lasted minutes. Then the SS officers withdrew to consult with their superiors. The bridge remained closed, but blocking the bridge was only the first part of Battel's plan. The SS could call for reinforcements. They could escalate the situation. The Wehrmacht could not hold the bridge indefinitely without provoking a full confrontation between the army and the SS. Battel and Liedtke had bought time, but time was limited. That same afternoon, Battel led a detachment of Wehrmacht soldiers into the ghetto. He brought trucks. His mission was extraction. He went directly to the Jewish workers employed by the Wehrmacht and their families. He informed them that they would be evacuated to the Wehrmacht barracks under military protection. The soldiers loaded approximately 100 Jews onto the trucks. Families climbed aboard with whatever possessions they could carry. Children were lifted into the truck beds. The elderly were helped up. The convoy drove out of the ghetto across the bridge and into the Wehrmacht compound. Once inside the barracks, the Jews were placed under the protection of the German army. The SS could not enter a Wehrmacht facility without authorization. As long as the Jews remained under military jurisdiction, they were untouchable. The rest of Przemiel's Jewish population had no such protection. Over the following days, the SS carried out the action. Thousands of Jews were rounded up in the ghetto, marched to the railway station, and loaded onto freight trains. The trains traveled to Belzec. Upon arrival, the passengers were told to undress for showers. They were driven into gas chambers. Carbon monoxide from diesel engines filled the sealed rooms. Death came within 15 to 20 minutes. The bodies were buried in mass graves. The entire process from arrival to burial took a few hours per transport. The Jews of Przemiel, including the head of the Judenrat, Dr. Duldig, were murdered at Belzec. The exact number killed in the July 1942 action is estimated at several thousand. The 100 people in the Wehrmacht barrack survived. The SS did not forget the bridge. Within days, an investigation began. Who authorized the obstruction of an SS operation? Who ordered Wehrmacht soldiers to threaten SS personnel? Who evacuated Jews from a sealed ghetto? The names of Major Max Liedtke and Oberleutnant Albert Battel were at the center of the report. The investigation was not conducted locally. It went up the chain of command to the highest levels of the SS and Nazi Party. Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, personally reviewed the findings. Himmler had been the architect of the final solution. He oversaw the concentration camps, the Einsatzgruppe murder squads, and the entire apparatus of racial extermination. He was methodical, bureaucratic, and ruthless. He read the report on Albert Battel and made his position clear. Battel would be expelled from the Nazi Party and arrested immediately after the war's conclusion. Himmler could not arrest Battel during the war without provoking a confrontation with the Wehrmacht, but the order was issued. This man is marked. Himmler sent a copy of the incriminating file to Martin Bormann, the head of the Nazi Party Chancellery and Adolf Hitler's private secretary. Bormann controlled access to Hitler and wielded enormous influence over Nazi policy. The fact that Bormann received the file meant that Battel's actions had reached the attention of the highest Nazi leadership. Battel had not just defied the SS. He had defied the core ideology of the Nazi state. The party he had joined in 1933 now considered him a traitor. Yet Battel continued to serve in the Wehrmacht. He was not arrested in 1942. The investigation remained secret. Battel did not know that Himmler had issued an order for his arrest. He continued his duties in Przemiel as if nothing had happened. Why did Battel act? The historical record provides some clues. Before the war, Battel had a reputation among his colleagues for being friendly toward Jews. He had loaned money to a Jewish colleague when such actions were illegal. In Przemiel, he had been officially reprimanded for shaking the hand of Dr. Duldig, the Jewish council leader, in a cordial manner. German officers were expected to treat Jews as subhuman, to refuse physical contact, to express contempt. Battel did not. His behavior suggested that he rejected the racial ideology that animated Nazi policy. But rejection of ideology does not explain defiance of orders. Millions of Germans privately disagreed with Nazi racial policy, but did nothing to stop it. Fear, careerism, conformity, and the sheer weight of state power kept people silent. Battel had something else. He had authority. He had Major Liedtke's support. He had soldiers under his command. He had the bridge, and he made a calculation. Saving 100 people was possible. The cost was high, but the cost of obedience was higher. The Jews sheltered in the Wehrmacht barracks did not remain there permanently. The protection Battel offered was temporary. The Wehrmacht could not defy SS policy indefinitely. Over the following months, some of the rescued Jews were assigned to Wehrmacht labor details, which offered continued protection. Others were transferred to other ghettos or labor camps when the situation in Przemiel became untenable. The historical record does not trace the fate of all 100 individuals. Some survived the war. Others did not. What is certain is that on July 26, 1942, those 100 people were scheduled to die at Belzec, and because of Albert Battel, they did not die that day. In 1944, Battel was discharged from the Wehrmacht due to heart disease. He returned to Breslau, his hometown, only to find the city in chaos as the Red Army advanced from the east. In the final months of the war, Battel was drafted into the Volkssturm, the last-ditch militia formed by the Nazi regime to defend German territory. The Volkssturm took men too old or too sick for regular service, gave them rifles, and sent them to fight Soviet tanks. Battel was 53 years old with a weak heart. He was captured by Soviet forces and spent 2 years in a prisoner of war camp. He was released in 1946, emaciated and sick. Breslau, now called Wrocław, had become part of Poland. The German population was expelled. Battel had no home to return to. He settled in West Germany, in the town of Hattersheim am Main near Frankfurt. He tried to return to his profession as a lawyer, but the denazification courts blocked him. These courts were established by the Allied occupation authorities to remove former Nazis from positions of influence. Battel's Nazi Party membership from 1933 appeared on his record. The courts did not know about Przemiel. They did not know about the bridge, or the 100 Jews, or the SS investigation. They saw a former party member and denied him a law license. Battel took a job in a glass factory. He worked manual labor for 6 years. He never spoke publicly about what he had done in Przemiel. He died on March 17, 1952, at the age of 61. His death certificate listed heart disease. He was buried in Hattersheim. No honors were given. No newspaper recorded his passing. He disappeared into the anonymity of post-war Germany. The story of Albert Battel might have ended there, forgotten in the noise of reconstruction and the desire to move forward. But history has a way of surfacing buried truths. In the 1960s and 1970s, as Holocaust survivors began to speak more openly about their experiences, some remembered the German officer who had saved them in Przemiel. Testimonies were recorded. Documents were found in archives. In 1981, nearly 30 years after Battel's death, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial in Jerusalem, recognized him as righteous among the nations. This title is awarded to non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. It is the highest honor Israel can bestow on a foreigner. Battel's name was added to the Wall of Honor at Yad Vashem. A tree was planted in the Garden of the Righteous in his memory. The man who died in obscurity in a German factory town was now honored in the most sacred memorial to the Holocaust. The recognition of Albert Battel raised uncomfortable questions. If a Nazi party member could defy the SS and save Jews, what does that say about the millions who did not? The post-war narrative in Germany often divided people into simple categories: Nazis and resistors, perpetrators and victims. Battel fit neither category cleanly. He wore the uniform. He carried the party card. He served the regime. Yet he also blocked the bridge. The contradiction could not be explained away. Some historians argued that Battel was not truly a Nazi, that his party membership was a formality. Others pointed out that the Nazis were not a monolithic group, that there were degrees of complicity, and that individual choices mattered, even within a totalitarian system. What remains undeniable is that Battel had a choice, and he made it. He knew the consequences. He acted anyway. The investigation by the SS reveals something about the Nazi state. Himmler's order to arrest Battel after the war shows that the regime recognized the danger of disobedience, even limited disobedience. If one Wehrmacht officer could block an SS action, others might do the same. The entire machinery of the final solution depended on compliance. The trains had to run on time. The ghettos had to be liquidated on schedule. The camps had to process arrivals efficiently. Any disruption threatened the system. Battel's action was not a military rebellion. He did not call for the overthrow of the Nazi government. He did not organize a resistance movement. He simply refused to allow one specific atrocity to proceed. Yet, that refusal was enough to reach the desk of Adolf Hitler's inner circle. The Nazi state could not tolerate even small acts of defiance, because small acts revealed that the system was not invincible. The sergeant major who threatened to fire on the SS remains unnamed in the historical record. His identity is unknown. He followed orders from Battel and Liedtke, but he also had to make his own choice. When the SS column approached, he could have stood aside. He could have claimed that he was following orders, but those orders were themselves illegal under Nazi law. Obstructing the SS was insubordination. Threatening to shoot SS men was mutiny. The sergeant major made a decision in the moment, on that bridge, with his men watching, and the SS waiting. He chose to hold the line. Without him, Battel's plan would have failed. The bridge would have been crossed. The Jews would have been taken. The sergeant major's name is lost, but his action is recorded in the testimonies of survivors who saw Wehrmacht soldiers block the SS. The 100 Jews evacuated to the Wehrmacht barracks found themselves in a strange position. They were prisoners, but they were protected prisoners. They were under the jurisdiction of the German army, which meant the SS could not legally touch them without a direct order from higher authorities. But protection depended on the continued goodwill of the Wehrmacht and the stability of the military situation. As the war progressed and Germany's position deteriorated, such protections became harder to maintain. Some of the rescued Jews were transferred to labor camps where Wehrmacht supervision continued. Others were eventually absorbed into the general camp system as the Wehrmacht's authority weakened. The historical record is fragmentary. What is certain is that some survived. After the war, survivors testified about the German officer who had saved them. Their testimonies reached Yad Vashem and contributed to Batel's recognition. The relationship between the Wehrmacht and the SS was complex and often antagonistic. The Wehrmacht saw itself as a professional military organization with traditions dating back to the Prussian army. Officers prided themselves on discipline, honor, and adherence to military codes. The SS, by contrast, was a paramilitary organization loyal to Nazi ideology above all else. Many Wehrmacht officers viewed the SS as thugs in uniforms, politically motivated fanatics who did not understand real soldiering. This tension created space for actions like Batel's. Liedtke and Batel could justify their intervention on military grounds. They needed the Jewish workers for Wehrmacht operations, and the SS was disrupting those operations. This justification provided cover, even though the real motive was humanitarian. The Wehrmacht could not openly challenge Nazi racial policy, but it could assert its authority over matters defined as military necessity. Batel exploited this gray area. He framed the rescue as a military decision, not a moral one. That framing allowed him to act. Yet, it is important not to romanticize the Wehrmacht. The German army was deeply complicit in the Holocaust. Wehrmacht units participated in mass shootings of Jews in the Soviet Union. They provided logistical support for the Einsatzgruppen. They enforced racial policies in occupied territories. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the idea that the army was innocent while the SS carried out atrocities, has been thoroughly debunked by historians. The army knew. The army helped. But within that complicit institution, individual officers could still make individual choices. Batel's action does not redeem the Wehrmacht. It highlights the complexity of moral choice within immoral systems. Belzec, where the Jews of Przemiel were murdered, operated for 9 months in 1942. It was a small camp built for one purpose, killing. There were no barracks for long-term prisoners, no factories, no labor details. Trains arrived, passengers were unloaded, and they were dead within hours. By the time Belzec ceased operations in December 1942, an estimated 450,000 people had been murdered there. The camp was then dismantled. The buildings were torn down, the mass graves were dug up, and the bodies burned to hide the evidence, and the site was plowed over and planted with trees. The SS tried to erase Belzec from existence. For decades, the site remained unmarked and largely forgotten. It was not until the 1990s that a memorial was finally constructed. The Jews of Przemiel who died at Belzec left almost no trace. Their names, their stories, their faces are mostly lost. The 100 people Batel saved were exceptions. They lived to tell what happened. The post-war silence around Batel is telling. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, West Germany was focused on reconstruction, on integrating millions of expellees and refugees, on building a democracy out of the ruins of dictatorship. There was little appetite for examining the complexities of individual responsibility. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted major war criminals, but the vast majority of people who had participated in the Nazi regime returned to civilian life without facing justice. Many former Nazis held positions in the West German government, judiciary, and business world. The denazification process was inconsistent and often superficial. In this environment, stories like Batel's were uncomfortable. He was a Nazi party member who defied the Nazis. He served the Wehrmacht, but opposed an SS action. He did not fit the clean narratives that post-war Germany wanted to tell about itself. So, his story was not told. He died unknown. His widow received no recognition. His grave was unmarked. It took the work of Holocaust survivors and Israeli researchers to bring Batel's actions to light. In the 1970s, Dr. Ziv Goshen, an Israeli lawyer, began investigating cases of Germans who had saved Jews. Goshen tracked down documents, interviewed survivors, and compiled evidence. He submitted Batel's case to Yad Vashem. The review process was rigorous. Yad Vashem required proof that the person had acted to save Jews, that they had taken personal risk, and that they had acted without expectation of reward. Batel met all the criteria. In 1981, Yad Vashem made the decision. Albert Batel was recognized as righteous among the nations. His widow, who had lived in poverty and obscurity, received the news. She traveled to Jerusalem for the ceremony. She saw her husband's name inscribed among the righteous. She understood, finally, that what he had done mattered. The recognition of Batel by Yad Vashem was controversial in Germany. Some argued that a Nazi party member did not deserve such an honor, that his membership tainted his actions. Others pointed out that the honor recognized his defiance, not his party affiliation. The debate reflected deeper tensions in German society about how to remember the Nazi period. Could individuals be judged on specific actions, or did their broader complicity disqualify them from recognition? Yad Vashem's answer was clear: the action mattered. Batel had saved Jews. He had risked his life to do so. That deserved recognition, regardless of his political background. The story of the sergeant major at the bridge also raises the question of following orders. The sergeant major followed Batel's orders to block the bridge, but Batel's orders contradicted SS policy. In the hierarchy of Nazi Germany, the SS had authority over racial matters. The Wehrmacht was supposed to defer. The sergeant major could have refused Batel's orders and faced no punishment. He could have claimed that he was following SS authority. Instead, he followed Batel. He made a choice about which orders to obey. The Nuremberg trials after the war established that following orders was not a defense for war crimes. Individuals were responsible for their actions, even when acting under orders. The sergeant major's choice shows the flip side of that principle. Sometimes following orders is the right thing to do, even when those orders are technically insubordinate. The broader context of 1942 is essential to understanding Batel's action. By the summer of that year, the final solution was in full operation. The Wannsee Conference in January 1942 had formalized the plan to exterminate European Jewry. The death camps were operational. Trains were running daily from ghettos to gas chambers. The killing was systematic, bureaucratic, and unprecedented in scale. In this context, saving 100 people might seem insignificant. Hundreds of thousands were being murdered. What difference did 100 make? But to those 100 people, it made all the difference. Each person saved was a universe preserved. Families continued. Children grew up. Testimonies were given. The calculus of rescue is not about numbers. It is about the recognition that every life has infinite value. The role of Major Max Liedtke must also be acknowledged. Liedtke was Batel's superior officer. He approved the plan to block the bridge. He authorized the use of Wehrmacht trucks and soldiers. He provided institutional cover for the rescue. Liedtke was also investigated by the SS, but unlike Batel, he was not marked for arrest. This may be because Liedtke framed the intervention in military terms. He needed the Jewish workers for Wehrmacht operations. The SS could not easily override a military commander's operational decisions without escalating the conflict between the Wehrmacht and the SS. Liedtke used his authority strategically. He protected Batel from immediate consequences. The partnership between Liedtke and Batel was crucial. Neither could have acted alone. Together, they created the conditions for rescue. The Jews working for the Wehrmacht in Przemiel were tailors, cobblers, carpenters, and laborers. They performed essential services that the German military relied on. The Wehrmacht's dependence on Jewish labor was a practical matter. Skilled workers were scarce in occupied Poland. and Jews represented a trained workforce. This created a tension between the SS extermination policy and the Wehrmacht's operational needs. The SS argued that all Jews must be killed, regardless of their utility. The Wehrmacht argued that some Jews should be preserved for labor. This tension existed across occupied Europe. In some places, Wehrmacht commanders succeeded in delaying deportations by arguing that Jewish workers were essential. In other places, the SS overrode military objections. In Przemiel, Battel and Liedtke exploited this tension. They did not argue against the SS on moral grounds. They argued on practical grounds. The SS rejected the argument, but the Wehrmacht had already acted. By the time the SS could respond, the Jews were in the barracks. The concept of military necessity as a shield for humanitarian action appears repeatedly in the history of the Holocaust. Some Wehrmacht officers used it to save Jews, not because they were committed resistors, but because they recognized the moral bankruptcy of extermination policy and sought any available justification to act. This does not make them heroes in the traditional sense. They were still part of a criminal regime, but it makes them something more complex, people who found ways to subvert the system from within, using the system's own logic against itself. Battel's actions fall into this category. He did not renounce the Wehrmacht. He did not desert. He used his authority as a Wehrmacht officer to oppose an SS operation. The distinction is subtle but significant. The aftermath of the July 1942 action in Przemiel saw the city's Jewish population reduced from thousands to a few hundred. The remaining Jews were confined to a smaller ghetto and used for forced labor. Over the following year, additional actions were carried out. By the end of 1943, Przemiel was declared Judenfrei, free of Jews. The city's centuries-old Jewish community had been annihilated. The synagogues were destroyed or repurposed. The Jewish cemetery was desecrated. The homes were occupied by non-Jews. The erasure was nearly total. The 100 people sheltered by Battel and Liedtke represented a tiny fraction of what was lost, but they represented something: resistance to erasure. Their survival meant that the SS did not have complete control. The machinery could be disrupted. The plan could be opposed. In 2000, the German military, the Bundeswehr, took an official step to recognize Battel. A military barracks in Rendsburg was renamed Feldwebel-Schmid-Kaserne in honor of Anton Schmid, another Wehrmacht soldier who saved Jews and was executed for it. Battel's story was also highlighted in military education programs. The Bundeswehr's recognition of soldiers who defied Nazi orders was part of a broader effort to establish a moral framework for the modern German military. The message was clear: soldiers have a duty to disobey illegal orders. The example of men like Battel and Schmid was used to teach that following orders is not always the right thing to do. This was a significant shift. For decades, the Bundeswehr had avoided discussing Wehrmacht complicity in the Holocaust. By the 2000s, the institution was ready to confront that history and to honor the exceptions. The bridge over the San River in Przemiel still stands. It is a modern concrete structure now, rebuilt after the war. The old bridge, the one that Battel's soldiers held, is gone, but the location remains. Travelers crossing the San River into what was once the ghetto see the same view that the Wehrmacht sergeant major saw in July 1942. The river below, the city behind, the road ahead. There is no plaque marking what happened there. There is no memorial to the 100 Jews who were saved. The site is unmarked, part of the everyday traffic of a modern Polish city. But for those who know the history, the bridge is a reminder that geography can be destiny. Control of a single bridge meant control of access. Control of access meant control of life and death. On one morning in 1942, a German lieutenant understood that and made the bridge a barricade. The question of whether Battel was a good Nazi is meaningless. There is no such thing as a good Nazi. The Nazi Party was a criminal organization dedicated to genocide. Battel's membership in that party implicates him in its crimes. But Batel's action on July 26, 1942, was not the action of a Nazi. It was the action of a man who, for reasons we can only partially reconstruct, chose to defy the policy he was supposed to enforce. The contradiction does not resolve neatly. Batel was both complicit and defiant. He wore the uniform of the regime and opposed the regime's core mission. He followed orders and disobeyed orders. He was a product of his time and an exception to his time. History is full of such contradictions. They make us uncomfortable because they suggest that morality is not always clear, that people are not always consistent, and that the choices available in extreme circumstances are often terrible. The 100 Jews saved by Batel and Litka went on to live varied lives. Some survived the war and emigrated to Israel or the United States. Others remained in Europe. Some had children and grandchildren who never knew how close their ancestors came to dying in a gas chamber. The families scattered, the stories fragmented. Only a few survivors recorded their testimonies. Those testimonies sit in archives at Yad Vashem and other Holocaust memorial institutions. They tell of a German officer who arrived in trucks, who said that the Wehrmacht was taking them under protection, who saved them when everyone else was being loaded onto trains. The testimonies are matter-of-fact. Survivors did not sentimentalize Batel. They did not call him a saint. They called him the officer who saved us. That is the highest praise possible. The SS investigation into Batel was thorough. Himmler's personal involvement indicates how seriously the regime took the incident. The letter from Himmler to Martin Bormann, preserved in Nazi archives and later discovered by historians, is clinical in tone. It describes Batel's actions as a violation of racial policy. It notes his previous reprimand for friendly behavior toward Jews. It concludes that Batel is unreliable and should be dealt with after the war. The phrase "after the war" is revealing. Himmler could not arrest Batel immediately without provoking a crisis with the Wehrmacht. The army's leadership would not accept the arrest of an officer for protecting military interests. So, Himmler waited. He put Batel's name on a list. When the war ended, when the Wehrmacht was disbanded, when the SS had full control, then Batel would be arrested. But the war did not end the way Himmler expected. Germany lost. The SS was destroyed. Himmler committed suicide in British custody in May 1945. The list of people to be arrested was never executed. Batel survived, not because he was forgiven, but because the regime that wanted him dead collapsed. The denazification courts that blocked Batel from practicing law after the war operated on crude categories. They looked at party membership, rank, and position. They did not have the resources or the time to investigate individual actions. Batel's membership in the Nazi Party was recorded. His actions in Przemiel were not. The courts saw a former Nazi and denied him a license. The irony is that Batel was one of the few Nazis who had actively opposed the regime's extermination policy, yet he was punished while many others who had done nothing to oppose the Holocaust were allowed to return to their professions. The injustice of this situation reflects the limitations of denazification. It was a blunt instrument. It could not capture moral complexity. Batel accepted the verdict. He took the factory job. He did not appeal. He did not publicize his story. He lived quietly until his death in 1952. The factory where Batel worked in Hattersheim and Maine was a glass manufacturing plant. He performed manual labor, a sharp fall for a man who had been a lawyer and an officer. His co-workers did not know his history. He was just another middle-aged German trying to rebuild his life in the ruins of the Third Reich. Germany in the late 1940s and early 1950s was a hard place to live. Food was rationed. Housing was scarce. Millions of displaced persons moved through the country. The division of Germany into East and West created new tensions. The Marshall Plan began rebuilding the economy, but recovery was slow. Batel lived through this period in obscurity, working a job he was overqualified for, suffering from a weak heart, with no recognition of what he had done. He died in 1952, 7 years after the war ended, at a time when West Germany was still finding its footing. He was buried without honors. The decision by Yad Vashem to recognize Bat-Tel in 1981 was part of a broader effort to document and honor non-Jews who rescued Jews during the Holocaust. The Righteous Among the Nations program had begun in 1963, but it took time to identify and verify rescuers. Many rescuers were reluctant to come forward. Some feared reprisals from former Nazis or from communities that did not want the past revisited. Others felt that what they had done was simply their duty and did not deserve recognition. Survivors and researchers had to seek out the stories. In Bat-Tel's case, survivors from Przemiel who settled in Israel provided the initial testimonies. Researchers then tracked down documentation from German archives, including the SS investigation and Himmler's letter. The case was strong. Bat-Tel had saved Jews. He had risked his career and his life. He had acted without expectation of reward. Yad Vashem awarded him the title. A tree was planted in his honor. His name was inscribed on the Wall of Honor. For the first time, Albert Bat-Tel was recognized for what he had done. The tree planted for Bat-Tel in the Garden of the Righteous at Yad Vashem is one of thousands. Each tree represents an individual or a family that saved Jews. The garden is a forest now, dense with trees, each one a story. Visitors walk among them, reading the plaques, learning the names. The trees are a living memorial, growing and spreading, a symbol of life continuing. Bat-Tel's tree is not marked as special. It is one among many, but it stands as a reminder that even in the darkest time, even within the most criminal regime, individuals could choose to act. The forest at Yad Vashem is proof that such individuals existed. They were not common. They were not the majority, but they were real. The fate of Przemiel itself after the war reveals another layer of this history. The city, which had been a thriving center of Jewish culture for centuries, was left with almost no Jewish inhabitants. The synagogues that had stood for generations were gone. The Jewish quarter was absorbed into the general city layout. The gravestones in the Jewish cemetery were broken or stolen. The physical traces of Jewish Przemiel were methodically erased. This erasure was not unique. Across Eastern Europe, Jewish communities that had existed for 1,000 years were obliterated. The Holocaust was not just the murder of individuals. It was the murder of entire cultures, languages, ways of life. The Yiddish that had filled the streets of Przemiel fell silent. The traditions passed down through generations ended. The businesses closed forever. What Bat-Tel saved was not just 100 lives, but 100 connections to that lost world. Those survivors carried memories. They could testify. They could say, this is what was taken. This is what was lost. This is what we were. The logistical complexity of the July 1942 action in Przemiel was considerable. The SS had to coordinate with the railway administration to secure trains. They had to ensure that Belzec was ready to receive the transport. They had to mobilize guards and drivers. They had to seal the ghetto and prevent escape. Every element had to function smoothly. When Bat-Tel blocked the bridge, he disrupted that careful choreography. The SS could not simply ignore the obstruction. They had to respond, to negotiate, to escalate. That took time. Time meant delay. Delay meant opportunity. In the hours that the bridge was held, Jews in the ghetto understood that something unusual was happening. Some went into hiding. Some attempted to escape. The SS eventually completed the action, but the disruption had consequences. The SS reported the incident to Berlin. Investigations were launched. The smooth functioning of the extermination machinery was interrupted. That interruption was brief, but it was real. Bat-Tel had demonstrated that the machinery could be stopped, even temporarily. The broader lesson of Bat-Tel's story is about the availability of choice. In totalitarian systems, people often claim they had no choice. They followed orders. They did what they were told. They survived by complying. Bat-Tel's action demonstrates that even in Nazi Germany, even in occupied Poland, Even in the summer of 1942, when the killing was at its height, choices existed. The choices were constrained. The consequences were severe. But the possibility of defiance remained. Battel chose defiance. The sergeant major chose to follow him. Together, they blocked the bridge. That choice saved 100 people. It did not stop the Holocaust. It did not change the course of the war. But it proved that the machinery was not invincible, that individuals could disrupt it, and that moral action was possible even in the absence of any hope of success. The psychology of genocide requires the dehumanization of victims. The Nazis invested enormous effort in portraying Jews as less than human, as vermin, as a disease. This propaganda was essential to making mass murder acceptable to ordinary Germans. If Jews were subhuman, then killing them was not really murder. It was pest control. Battel's actions suggest that he rejected this dehumanization. He saw the Jewish workers as people. He knew their names. He shook Dr. Duldig's hand. These small gestures of recognition were revolutionary in the context of Nazi racial policy. When Battel loaded Jews onto Wehrmacht trucks and drove them to safety, he was performing an act of recognition. He was saying, "You are human. You deserve to live." This recognition was dangerous because it contradicted the foundation of Nazi ideology. If Jews were human, then murdering them was a crime. Battel understood this, even if he never articulated it in those terms. His actions spoke louder than ideology. The role of witnesses to Battel's actions must also be considered. The inhabitants of Przemiel, both Polish and Ukrainian, saw what happened on July 26, 1942. They saw the Wehrmacht block the bridge. They saw the confrontation with the SS. They saw German soldiers loading Jews onto trucks. This spectacle was unprecedented. For years, the local population had watched as the Germans systematically oppressed and murdered Jews. Resistance was rare. Collaboration was common. Fear dominated. But on that morning, they saw Germans opposing other Germans. They saw authority fracturing. They saw that the Nazi regime was not monolithic. This had psychological effects that are difficult to measure, but were nonetheless real. The image of Wehrmacht soldiers defying the SS challenged the perception of German invincibility. It suggested that cracks existed in the system. For the surviving Jews in the ghetto, the rescue of 100 people was a beacon. It proved that survival was possible, that not all Germans were murderers, that the future was not entirely predetermined. The documentation of Battel's actions is fragmentary but sufficient. The SS investigation produced reports. Himmler's letter to Bormann survives in archives. Survivor testimonies were recorded by Yad Vashem. Wehrmacht records from Przemiel note the incident, though in euphemistic language. Piecing together the full story required decades of research. Historians had to cross-reference German military archives, SS files, Polish municipal records, and survivor testimonies. The fact that the story can be reconstructed at all is remarkable. Many acts of rescue during the Holocaust went unrecorded. People saved others and never spoke of it. They died without recognition. Battel's story survived because survivors remembered and because the SS investigation left a paper trail. The bureaucratic nature of the Nazi regime, which documented even its own internal conflicts, preserved the evidence of Battel's defiance. The comparison between Battel and other Wehrmacht officers who helped Jews is instructive. Major Karl Plagg, for example, ran a vehicle repair shop in Vilnius that employed Jewish workers. Plagg deliberately expanded his operation to protect as many Jews as possible. He warned them before liquidation actions. He found ways to delay deportations. Unlike Battel, Plagg worked within the system. He did not directly confront the SS. He used bureaucracy and military necessity as shields. Both approaches had value. Battel's confrontation was dramatic and risky. Plagg's subterfuge was methodical and sustained. Together, these stories illustrate the range of choices available to Wehrmacht officers. Some did nothing. Some actively participated in atrocities. A few, like Battel and Plagg, found ways to save lives. The ratio is depressing. For every officer who helped, hundreds or thousands did not. But the existence of exceptions proves that action was possible. The historical memory of Albert Battel remains contested. In Germany, his recognition as righteous among the nations prompted debates about how to remember the Wehrmacht. Some veterans groups objected, arguing that honoring Battel implied that other Wehrmacht officers were guilty by comparison. Historians pointed out that this was precisely the point. Battel's exceptionalism highlighted the fact that most officers did not act as he did. The Wehrmacht, as an institution, was complicit in the Holocaust. Individual exceptions like Battel did not change that reality. They simply proved that exceptions were possible. The debate continues. Every time Battel's story is told, it raises uncomfortable questions about responsibility, choice, and the nature of courage. The education of future generations about figures like Battel is complicated by the contradictions in his biography. How do you teach about a Nazi party member who defied the Nazis? How do you present his story without either excusing his party membership or dismissing his rescue action? Educators struggle with this balance. Some focus on the rescue and minimize the party membership. Others emphasize the membership and present the rescue as an insufficient redemption. The most honest approach acknowledges both. Battel was a man embedded in a criminal system who on one day chose to act against that system. He is neither a hero nor a villain in simple terms. He is a human being who made choices. Some of those choices were complicit. One was defiant. History is not a morality play. It is the record of what people did in all its complexity. The impact of Battel's action on the SS should not be underestimated. The SS prided itself on being the vanguard of Nazi racial policy. They saw themselves as the true believers, the ones willing to do what was necessary to achieve Hitler's vision. When a Wehrmacht officer blocked their operation, it was not just a practical setback. It was an ideological affront. The SS reported the incident up the chain of command because it revealed a weakness. If the Wehrmacht could obstruct SS operations, then the entire structure of authority was unstable. Himmler's response, marking Battel for arrest, was meant to send a message. No one defies the SS without consequences. But the message was undermined by the fact that Himmler could not act immediately. He had to wait until after the war. This delay revealed that the SS power was not absolute. The Wehrmacht still had autonomy in certain areas. The tension between the two organizations was a feature of the Nazi state, and Battel exploited it. The question of what Battel thought about his actions is unanswerable. He left no memoir. He gave no interviews. The historical record contains his actions, but not his inner life. Did he believe he had done the right thing? Did he regret joining the Nazi Party? Did he wish he had done more? We cannot know. What we know is that he acted, that he faced consequences, and that he lived the rest of his life in obscurity. His silence after the war might have been shame. It might have been exhaustion. It might have been a recognition that no one wanted to hear complicated stories about Nazis who saved Jews. Post-war Germany wanted clean narratives. Perpetrators and victims, guilt and innocence. Battel fit neither category. His silence was perhaps a form of self-protection. The Wehrmacht's use of Jewish labor was widespread across occupied Europe. Jews were employed in factories, workshops, construction sites, and military installations. This labor was forced and unpaid. It was exploitation. But it also created a pragmatic argument against immediate extermination. Dead Jews cannot work. Some Wehrmacht officers used this argument to delay deportations. They claimed that Jewish workers were essential to military operations. This bought time. For some Jews, it meant survival. For others, it simply delayed the inevitable. Battel's use of this argument on July 26, 1942, was consistent with practices elsewhere. What made his action unique was the direct confrontation with the SS. Most officers who argued for preserving Jewish labor did so through bureaucratic channels. They wrote memos, They submitted requests. They negotiated. Battel did not negotiate. He acted first and justified later. This inversion of the usual order was what made his actions so shocking. The survivors of the July 1942 action in Przemiel, who were not saved by Battel, experienced the full horror of Belzec. They were packed into freight cars with no food, water, or sanitation. The journey took hours. Upon arrival, they were driven from the trains with whips and dogs. They were told to undress for showers. They were herded into gas chambers disguised as bathhouses. The doors were sealed. Diesel engines pumped carbon monoxide into the chambers. Death took 15 to 20 minutes, but it was agonizing. The bodies were then removed by Jewish prisoners who were forced to work in the camp. These prisoners extracted gold teeth, cut hair, and dragged the corpses to mass graves. The entire process was designed for efficiency. Belzec could murder thousands of people per day. The Jews of Przemiel were a fraction of the total. Their deaths were recorded as numbers in SS reports. No names, no identities, just numbers. The 100 people saved by Battel escaped this fate. That is what his action meant in concrete terms. The moral weight of the Holocaust rests not just on the 6 million murdered, but on the millions who were complicit, who watched, who benefited, or who did nothing. Battel's action does not lift that weight. It does not excuse Germany. It does not redeem the Wehrmacht. But it does demonstrate that within the machinery of genocide, individual moral agency still existed. People could choose. Most chose complicity or passivity. A few chose defiance. Battel was one of the few. His story is a reminder that historical responsibility is both collective and individual. Germany, as a nation, bears responsibility for the Holocaust. The Nazi Party bears responsibility. The SS bears responsibility. The Wehrmacht bears responsibility. But within those structures, individuals made choices. Battel chose to block the bridge. That choice was his, and he must be judged for it. The judgment is not simple. It is not comfortable. But it is necessary. The years Battel spent working in the glass factory in Hattersheim and Maine were years of physical decline. His heart condition worsened. The labor was hard on a man in his 50s with a weak heart. He earned a modest wage. He lived in a small apartment. He had no savings. The Germany he had fought for in World War I no longer existed. The Germany he had served in World War II had been defeated and divided. He was a man without a country, in a sense, a relic of a past that everyone wanted to forget. His death in 1952 was quiet. A few people attended his funeral. He was buried in a municipal cemetery. The grave was marked with a simple stone. For decades, no one visited. His story was unknown. The town of Hattersheim had no idea that a righteous among the nations had died within its borders. The modern visitor to Przemiel can walk through the city and see few traces of its Jewish past. The main synagogue was destroyed during the war. A few buildings that once housed Jewish institutions remain, but they have been repurposed. The Jewish cemetery is overgrown, the gravestones toppled or stolen. There is a small memorial marking the site of the ghetto. It is a simple plaque, easy to miss. The San River flows, as it always has. The bridge is functional, carrying traffic without ceremony. The city has moved on. It is a Polish city now, with Polish history and Polish concerns. The Jewish chapter has been closed, but for those who seek it out, the history is there. Archives hold documents. Museums hold artifacts. Survivors and their descendants hold memories. The story of what happened in Przemiel in 1942 is not lost. It is simply quiet. The mechanics of how Battel organized the rescue reveal careful planning. He did not act impulsively. In the days before July 26th, he identified which Jewish workers were employed by the Wehrmacht. He compiled lists of names and families. He arranged for trucks to be available. He coordinated with Major Litka to ensure command authority. He positioned soldiers at the bridge with clear instructions. When the moment came, the operation was executed with military precision. The trucks entered the ghetto and went directly to specific addresses. Jewish families were told to gather essentials quickly. There was no time for sentiment. Belongings were left behind. Homes were abandoned. The priority was speed. Within hours, 100 people were inside the Wehrmacht barracks. The entire operation demonstrated that Battel understood military logistics. He used the tools of his profession, command authority, transportation, armed force, to achieve a humanitarian goal. The Wehrmacht was built to fight wars, but on that day, it was used to save lives. The reaction of the Jewish community in the ghetto to Battel's rescue was likely mixed. Relief for those saved, despair for those left behind. Survivor testimony suggests that some Jews initially feared the Wehrmacht trucks were part of the SS operation, another trick to facilitate the roundup. Trust was impossible when every German action had proven deadly. Only when the trucks drove away from the trains and toward the Wehrmacht barracks did people begin to understand that this was different. Even then, the future was uncertain. Being under Wehrmacht protection was better than being deported to Belzec, but it was not freedom. The rescued Jews remained prisoners. Their survival depended on the continued goodwill of their captors. They understood this precariousness. They knew that protection could be withdrawn at any moment. They lived with that fear every day. The nature of courage in extreme circumstances is complex. Battel's action required physical courage. He faced armed SS men and risked violent confrontation. It required moral courage. He defied orders and ideology he was expected to support. It required social courage. He broke ranks with his peers and invited condemnation. Courage is often portrayed as a momentary burst of heroism, but Battel's courage was sustained. He had to plan the rescue, execute it, and live with the consequences. He had to endure the SS investigation. He had to accept that his career was over, that he would be marked as a traitor by the regime he had served. This kind of sustained courage is rare. It requires not just a momentary willingness to act, but a long-term commitment to accept the price of that action. Battel paid that price for the rest of his life. The archival discovery of the Himmler letter to Bormann regarding Battel was a significant moment in Holocaust historiography. The letter, written in bureaucratic Nazi language, is chilling in its matter-of-factness. Himmler describes Battel's defiance as a security concern and a violation of racial policy. He recommends expulsion from the party and arrest after the war. The tone is clinical, as if discussing routine administrative matters. This coldness is characteristic of Nazi documentation. The genocide was conducted with paperwork, orders, reports, and files. The letter about Battel is part of that paper trail. It exists because the Nazi regime documented everything, including its own internal conflicts. Historians found the letter in captured German archives after the war. It provided proof of what Battel had done and how the Nazi leadership responded. Without this document, Battel's story might have remained unknown. The legacy of the righteous among the nation's program is profound. Since its inception, over 27,000 individuals from 51 countries have been recognized. Each recognition represents a story of rescue, of risk, of moral courage. The program has become a cornerstone of Holocaust education, providing examples of human decency in a time of inhumanity. Critics argue that the program focuses too much on exceptional individuals and not enough on the systemic failures that made the Holocaust possible. This criticism has merit. The rescue of individual Jews by individual non-Jews does not change the fact that millions were murdered with the complicity of entire societies. But the program serves another purpose. It demonstrates that even in the worst circumstances, people can choose to do the right thing. That message is essential. It counters the despair that can come from studying genocide. It says, yes, humanity is capable of great evil, but it is also capable of great good. The bridge at Przemiel stands as a metaphor for the choices that defined World War II. On one side, the machinery of extermination. On the other, 100 people who might survive. Between them, a handful of German soldiers who decided which way the bridge would open. For one morning in July 1942, the bridge opened toward life. Albert Battel held that bridge not with speeches or manifestos, but with simple refusal. He refused to let the SS pass. He refused to accept that orders justified atrocity. He refused to be complicit. That refusal, small as it was in the vast landscape of the Holocaust, mattered. It saved lives. It proved that resistance was possible. It demonstrated that even in the darkest hour, when the entire weight of a totalitarian state pressed down on individual conscience, a single person could still choose to act. If this story gave you a new way to see World War II, share and subscribe, and tell us which moment surprised you most. We'll return next week with another chapter in the war that changed the world.